The morning Birdie Barrett buried her sister was the same morning she became a mother to a 5-month-old boy who had no idea how thoroughly his small arrival had just rearranged the entire geography of her life. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in the Texas Panhandle, where the wind came howling down from the north like it had a grievance against every living thing it touched. The town of Caldwell Creek sat on a flat stretch of prairie that offered no shelter from that wind, no trees thick enough to break it, no hills grand enough to slow it down. The church was a white-painted building that needed repainting, and the preacher who read the words over Clara Barrett's grave was a man who had buried more people than he had married in this unforgiving stretch of country. Birdie stood at the graveside with the baby wrapped in a flannel blanket against her chest, and she held him so tightly that later, when she looked down at her own arms, she could see the red marks from the wool pressing into her skin. She did not cry. She had already cried everything she had the night before, alone in Clara's small house, sitting on the floor with her back against the bed because she could not bring herself to climb into it. By the time the sun came up, she was empty and clean in the way that grief sometimes leaves a person, scoured down to something harder and more essential. Her sister had died from a fever that had come on fast and taken hold with a viciousness that the town doctor, a man named Holt who smelled of turpentine and did his best, had not been able to combat. Clara's husband, Thomas, had ridden out 6 months before that and never come back. Some said he had gone to the silver fields in New Mexico territory. Some said he had gone somewhere worse. Either way, he was gone, and the baby named Samuel had never properly known his father, and now he would never know his mother. And so Birdie packed what remained in Clara's house into 2 canvas bags and walked the 3 dusty miles to her own small homestead on the edge of Caldwell Creek and began the project of raising Samuel Barrett as her own. She was 24 years old then, unmarried, with a 1-room house that she had expanded by 2 rooms with her own hands and the help of her neighbor, old Jeremiah Foss, who was 70 and half deaf, but still knew how to swing a hammer when the occasion called for it. She ran a small millinery shop out of the front room, making hats and doing alterations, and occasionally taking in laundry when the money needed supplementing. The women of Caldwell Creek came to her because her work was careful and her prices were fair, and because she never gossiped, which in a small town was a quality rarer and more valued than gold. For 5 years, Birdie raised Samuel alone. 5 years of early mornings and late nights. 5 years of teaching him to walk, and watching him fall, and picking him up and setting him on his feet again. 5 years of mending his clothes when he wore through the knees, and reading to him by lamplight from the 2 books she owned, and explaining death to him in the gentlest terms she could manage, because he asked about his mother the way all children ask about things that are missing from their understanding, directly, and without any of the social grace that adults develop to soften such questions. She told him his mother had been the best person she had ever known, which was the truth, and that she was somewhere warm and peaceful now, which she hoped was true, and that he was loved every single day, which was absolute and irrefutable fact. By the time Samuel was 5 years old and marching off to the small schoolhouse that Caldwell Creek had finally managed to build in 1882, Birdie was 29, and she had the particular quality of a woman who has been tested hard and come through it. There was a steadiness in her eyes that strangers sometimes mistook for coldness, until they got close enough to see the warmth underneath it. She was not what anyone in Caldwell Creek would call a beauty in the theatrical sense, but she had dark hair that she kept pinned up and a face that was honest and expressive, and when she smiled, which she did easily and often, the whole room felt it. The town had grown in those 5 years. The cattle trails had brought money, and money had brought a hotel and a proper saloon and a new general store run by a man named Duffy who stocked goods from as far as St. Louis. The railroad had been talked about for years and had finally sent a surveying crew through in the spring of 1883, and the whole town buzzed with the possibility of connection to something larger than itself. Birdie had watched all of this expansion from the doorway of her millinery shop, with Samuel on her hip in the early years, and then beside her knee, and then standing straight and proud on his own small feet, and she had felt something uncomplicated and good about the life she was building in this difficult and beautiful country. She was not looking for anything else. She told herself this often enough that she believed it. The afternoon Marshall McCrae rode into Caldwell Creek was an ordinary Tuesday in early June of 1883, when the heat had already settled in thick and unrelenting, and the main street of town shimmered at its far end like something not quite real. Birdie was sweeping the boardwalk in front of her shop when she heard the horse, and she looked up out of simple curiosity, the way a person does when movement catches the corner of their eye. He rode a bay horse that was road-weary but still moving with the kind of easy authority that meant the animal had been well treated and was returning the favor. The man in the saddle was tall even sitting down, which Birdie could tell from the way he had to lean slightly forward to accommodate his length against the horse's motion. He wore a dusty brown hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, and a canvas coat that had seen considerable wear, and he rode with the relaxed and total confidence of someone who had been on horseback since before he could properly walk. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a year or two more, and he had a face that was all planes and angles, weathered to a deep tan, with dark brows and eyes that, even from across the street, caught the light in a way that made Birdie notice them before she had consciously decided to notice him at all. He drew up in front of the hotel, swung down from the saddle with a single smooth movement, and tied his horse to the post with the practiced ease of a man who has done that particular motion 10,000 times. Then he looked up, and his eyes went across the street and found her standing there with her broom, and he tipped his hat in a small, straightforward gesture that acknowledged nothing more than the basic courtesy owed to a person on a public street. Birdie went back to her sweeping. She did not think about him again until Samuel came flying through the front door of the shop that evening with a story about the new cowboy at the hotel who had shown him how to make a lasso out of a length of rope, while Samuel was sitting on the front steps of the hotel waiting for nothing in particular. He was very good at it, Samuel announced, climbing onto the stool beside the counter with the absolute confidence of a child who assumed his news was as important as any other news in the world. He made a loop, and then he made it go round and round over his head, and then he threw it, and it landed right over the fence post. Right over it. "Is that so?" Birdie said, not looking up from the hat brim she was stitching. "He said if I practiced every day I could do it too. He said the rope doesn't care how old you are, it only cares how much attention you pay it. That is a reasonable thing to say about a rope. His name is Marshall. He has a horse named Duchess. That is a good name for a horse. I think Duchess likes me. She put her nose on my hair." Birdie did look up then, because Samuel was grinning in the particular way he grinned when something had genuinely delighted him, with his whole face, his eyes completely bright, and she felt the familiar complicated thing she always felt when he was happy, which was joy and grief pressed together so tightly they could not be separated, because he had Clara's smile exactly. The same generous and uncomplicated quality that had made Clara Barrett the kind of person everyone in a room naturally turned toward. "Did you thank him for showing you?" she asked. "Yes. He said I was a natural." Samuel paused to consider the tremendous dignity of this assessment. "I think he might be the most interesting person I've ever seen." "You are 5 years old," Birdie told him. "You haven't seen very many people yet." "I've seen plenty," Samuel said, with the serene certainty of a child. She saw Marshall McCrae the next morning at Duffy's General Store, where she had gone to buy thread and a length of ribbon that a customer had ordered for a hat commission. He was at the counter talking to Duffy about whether there was work available in the area, and Duffy was telling him about the Harlan Ranch to the east, which was the biggest cattle operation within 40 miles, and almost always needed experienced hands. Birdie moved quietly through the store gathering her items, but the space was small enough that she could hear the conversation without intending to, and she registered the quality of his voice, which was unhurried and direct, without any of the performative roughness that some men put on in the West like a costume they thought the land required of them. "I'm not looking to stay permanently," he said to Duffy. "Just long enough to earn something reasonable and rest the horse." "Harlan'll treat you fair," Duffy said. "He's a hard man, but he pays what he promises." When Birdie set her items on the counter, Marshall stepped back to give her room, and she saw that up close his eyes were a dark brown with a quality of attention in them that was not intrusive but was very present, the eyes of someone who looks at what is in front of him and actually sees it. "Good morning," she said, because she was not a person who pretended other people were invisible. "Good morning," he said. "You're the milliner, aren't you? Your shop is across from the hotel." "I am, Birdie Barrett." "Marshall McCrae." He did not offer to shake her hand, which was correct by the conventions of the time, but he looked at her with the direct openness of a person who meant what he said and expected the same in return. "Your boy told me your shop makes the best hats in the county." "My nephew," she said, with the small automatic correction she had been making for 5 years. "Samuel, and he has never been inside any other millinery shop in the county, so his comparison is limited." Something moved in Marshall's face that might have been amusement and might have been something more. "He speaks highly of you," he said. "He is a generous child," Birdie said, and paid Duffy for her goods and walked back out into the morning sun. She thought about the conversation twice more during the day, which annoyed her, because there had been nothing in it that warranted thinking about twice, and she was a practical woman who had no patience for her own sentimentality when it arose uninvited. Marshall McCrae took work at the Harlan Ranch as Duffy had suggested, and he rode out to it the following morning with the easy directness of a man who had made a decision and was done deliberating. But the ranch was only 8 miles east of Caldwell Creek, and ranch hands came into town on their off days for supplies and company and the occasional drink at the saloon, and so Birdie saw him with a regularity that was not engineered by either of them, but was simply the natural result of a small town and an 8-mile distance. The third time she saw him, he was fixing the wheel of a wagon that had thrown a spoke outside the livery stable, working with a quiet, focused efficiency that drew a small audience of the idle, which he appeared not to notice. Samuel was beside her, and Samuel noticed him immediately in the way that children notice people who have made a favorable impression on them. "Mr. McCrae," Samuel called out, in a voice with absolutely no indoor quality to it. Marshall looked up from the wheel, and his face did the thing that Birdie had already begun to identify as characteristic, a shift from focused concentration to an open and genuine ease, a real smile that did not appear to cost him anything. "Samuel," he said, "how's the rope work coming?" "I've been practicing," Samuel said solemnly. "I can get it to go round most of the time." "Most of the time is more than none of the time," Marshall said. "Keep at it." He looked at Birdie then with that same direct and uncomplicated regard and said, "Miss Barrett." "Mr. McCrae," she said, "that spoke looks like it may need replacing rather than just resetting." He looked at the wheel and then looked back at her with a flicker of surprise and what she thought might be approval. "You're right," he said. "Do you know something about wagon wheels?" "My neighbor Jeremiah Foss taught me. He said a woman alone ought to know how to fix what breaks, because things in this country break all the time and help is not always adjacent." "That is a wise piece of advice," Marshall said. "He was a wise man," she said. "He died 2 winters ago." There was a small silence, the kind that lives between strangers when one of them has disclosed something more real than the occasion seemed to call for, and both of them are deciding whether to acknowledge it or let it pass. Marshall let it land without deflecting. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and she believed that he was. The weeks moved through June and into July, and Caldwell Creek settled into the rhythms of a hot summer, with the cattle trade moving and the hotel busy, and the millinery shop doing good enough business that Birdie was able to patch the roof properly, and not just with the borrowed tar she had been using the previous spring. Samuel finished his school term and was given the whole of July to be ungoverned and loud, which he took to with tremendous enthusiasm. He and Marshall McCrae developed a friendship that Birdie watched with an emotion she could not entirely name, something between gratitude and caution, a complicated country between two simpler places. Marshall was in town most Saturdays, and Samuel had an unerring instinct for where he was, appearing beside him at the livery stable or the general store, or outside the saloon where children were not permitted, but where they routinely congregated on the steps to intercept any interesting adults going in or out. Marshall talked to the boy with the straightforward respect of someone who did not condescend to children, and Samuel responded to this by attaching himself to the man with the determined completeness of a child who had decided something. Birdie watched. She was careful. She had been careful for 5 years in the particular way that a woman alone must be careful, not because she was timid, but because every decision she made had consequences for Samuel as well as herself, and she did not have the luxury of being wrong. The evening she actually talked to Marshall McCrae with more than the surface courtesy of acquaintance was a Saturday in mid-July when a thunderstorm came up from the southwest with very little warning, the way the worst storms in that country tended to, and the whole town scrambled to get horses stabled and goods inside and shutters latched. Birdie was caught at Duffy's with Samuel and 3 bags of groceries, and the street became a running river within minutes of the first lightning. She was standing in Duffy's doorway calculating whether to make a run for it when Marshall appeared out of the rain with a wagon he had borrowed from the livery for the day. "I'll drive you," he said. Just like that, no elaborate offer, just the plain fact of it. "We're 3 blocks," she said. 3 blocks is enough to get soaked through," he said, and jumped down to take the grocery bags from her before she had properly decided whether to accept the help. She helped Samuel up onto the wagon seat and climbed up herself, and Marshall drove them the 3 blocks through the hammering rain and helped them down at her door and handed her the bags, and Samuel was already inside, and there was a moment on the porch in the rain-loud dark where Marshall was standing close enough that she could see the water running down from the brim of his hat and the expression on his face, which was just a man looking at a woman with something honest and uncomplicated in it. "Would you come in out of the rain?" she said. It was not entirely a question. He came in, and she made coffee because it was what there was to make, and Samuel sat at the kitchen table with the gravity of a child who understands that something of consequence is happening and wishes to be present for it, and Marshall sat across from her with his hat on the table between them, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. The storm moved through and quiet came back to the town, but neither of them marked its passing because the conversation had its own weather. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, that he had been cowboying since he was 17, that he had no family left except a brother in Kansas, whom he wrote to occasionally and saw rarely. He had come to Texas from New Mexico Territory, which he had left because of a complicated situation involving a cattle operation and a dishonest foreman that he described without self-pity, but with a blunt accuracy that told her he was not a man who flinched from his own history. She told him about Clara and about Samuel and about the 5 years, and he listened with a quality of attention that was not performance, a real listening that she felt in the space between them, steady and quiet and entirely present. "That's a hard thing," he said when she had told the shape of it. "Losing your sister and then taking on her child." "It wasn't a burden," she said immediately, with a clarity that surprised even her with its force. "I want to be clear about that. Samuel is not a thing that happened to me. He is the best part of my life." Marshall looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and something in his face settled like a thing that had been held in suspension had found the place it was looking for. "I can see that," he said. "He knows it too. It's in the way he talks about you. He talks about me. Every time I see him, there was a warmth in his voice that was unguarded and real. He told me you read to him every night even when you're tired." He told me you know how to make the bread with the honey glaze that's the best thing he's ever eaten. He told me you cry at the end of sad stories, even when you think he can't see it. Birdie felt heat come to her face that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the overwhelming and unexpected quality of being seen, of having the life she had been quietly living reflected back at her by someone outside it. He is very observant, she managed. He is a wonderful boy, Marshall said, and there was nothing in it that sounded like flattery, nothing that sounded like a man saying a thing because he thought it was what a woman wanted to hear. It sounded like a man saying what was simply and completely true. He left when the night had gotten deep, with a courtesy and an absence of any kind of pressure that she noted and appreciated. She stood at the window and watched him walk down the street toward the hotel where he stayed on Saturday nights, and she put her hand flat against the glass because the night was cooling and the glass was cool, and she needed something solid under her palm. She was not going to be foolish about this. She told herself that clearly. But she was already thinking about the way his voice had sounded when he said it was a wonderful boy, and the way his hands had looked around the coffee cup, and the particular quality of his attention, and she understood that the ground under her practical, careful feet had shifted, while she was not paying close enough attention to prevent it. The summer deepened. The conversations continued, growing longer and more particular each time, developing the texture of a relationship that was building itself unhurriedly, but with a clear direction, the way a river finds its course not through force, but through the patient accumulation of movement in one direction. Marshall began stopping by the shop on Saturdays before his visits to the general store, which was in the opposite direction, and if Birdie noticed this logistical reorganization of his route, she said nothing about it, because she was making similar adjustments to her own Saturday schedule without acknowledging them to herself. He taught Samuel to ride on a quiet Saturday afternoon in early August, using a small and patient mare he borrowed from the Harlan Ranch. Samuel sat on the mare's back with the enormous solemnity of a person undertaking something consequential, and Marshall walked beside him in the paddock behind the livery stable, one hand near the bridle, talking to him in the low and easy way he had with the boy, and Birdie watched from the fence with her arms folded on the top rail and her chin resting on her arms, and felt something she had been resisting feel itself. It was not a dramatic thing, not a sudden overwhelming surge. It was quieter than that and more real, a warmth that had been building incrementally all summer, arriving at a place where it could no longer be mistaken for anything other than what it was. She watched Marshall McCrae walking beside her nephew in a dusty paddock in the Texas heat, patient and sure, and she loved him. She understood that she had been falling toward this for weeks and had simply refused to look down. The understanding was terrifying and very good. She said nothing about it. She was not a person who said things before she was certain of the ground, and she was not certain enough yet of what was between them to name it out loud. But the naming of it in her own interior changed things, gave the summer a different quality, sharpened everything. It was Lucinda Harlan who first said anything. Lucinda was the rancher's wife, a forthright woman of 40 with strong opinions and no reluctance to share them, who came into the millinery shop in the third week of August for a new bonnet and who sat in the chair beside the counter while Birdie took her measurements and said, with the directness Birdie had learned to expect from her, "McCrae talks about you." Birdie's hands did not stop moving. "Does he?" "He does not say a great deal," Lucinda acknowledged, "because that man appears constitutionally incapable of talking a great deal. But when he says something, he means it. And on 2 separate occasions in the past month, when the conversation at supper has turned to Caldwell Creek, he has said something about you, or about Samuel, which is the same thing from the sound of it." "We are acquaintances," Birdie said. Lucinda made a sound of profound skepticism. "A man does not reorganize his Saturday errands for an acquaintance," she said. James Harlan noticed it. "He said McCrae comes in from the direction of town on Saturday evenings looking like a man who has just had the best day of his week." Birdie said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say that was also true, and she did not make a habit of things that were not true. "He is a good man," Lucinda said, with the matter-of-fact authority of a woman who had employed and known many men in her time. "He is steady. He works hard and he does not complain and he does not lie. He is respectful of every person he deals with, which in my experience is far less common than it ought to be." She paused. "And he is clearly half gone on you, Birdie Barrett, which is also not common, and you would be a very particular kind of fool to pretend you do not see it." After Lucinda left, Birdie stood in the middle of her shop for a long time, holding a spool of ribbon that she did not need for anything, and looked out the window at the street. The thing that happened next happened on a Saturday evening when the summer was beginning to breathe its first whisper of autumn, the nights cooling just slightly at their edges, the light going golden earlier. Marshall had come to the shop in the late afternoon, as had become his habit, and they had talked for an hour about nothing particularly important, the easy kind of talking that is itself the most important kind because it means two people are comfortable in each other's presence. Samuel had fallen asleep on the small daybed in the back room, which he sometimes did on warm afternoons, and the shop had the quiet of early evening, the last customers long gone. At some point the talking had stopped and the quiet had come in, but it was not an uncomfortable quiet. Marshall was looking at her in the way he had sometimes looked at her recently, with something behind his eyes that he had not yet put into words, and Birdie, who had been waiting for the words with a patience that had cost her more than she showed, felt suddenly that she could not wait any more. "You are looking at me," she said, "like you want to say something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about Samuel." She had not expected that particular beginning, and something in her went careful. "What about him?" Marshall put his hat down on the counter between them, which was the gesture she had come to recognize as the one he made when he was about to say something that mattered to him. "He is a good boy," he said. "He is one of the best people I have met in a long time, and I have met a considerable number of people. He talks about his mother sometimes. He talks about her with a kind of—" he stopped and chose his next word with care. "Respect. Like she is a real person to him even though he never knew her properly. That's because of how you've talked about her to him." Birdie's throat tightened. "I try." "You don't try," Marshall said very directly. "You succeed. There is a difference." He looked at her. "You have given him a good life, Birdie, a real life. He is confident and kind and curious, and he doesn't have a fearful bone in his body, which in a child who has been through loss is remarkable. That is you. That is 5 years of you." She could not speak for a moment. She pressed her lips together and looked at the counter. "But," Marshall said, and the word was gentle, "he needs a father too." The words fell into the room and she felt them land, not as an accusation, never as an accusation, but as a plain and honest thing said by a person who meant it plainly and honestly. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an openness that was more vulnerable than she had ever seen him, the careful steadiness he wore most of the time set aside, and underneath it was just a man who was telling her something true about himself and hoping she would hear it the way it was meant. "He needs a father too," he said again, more quietly. "And I think you know that I am not only talking about Samuel." The lamp on the counter threw a warm circle of light over both of them, and outside the window the street of Caldwell Creek was settling into the blue quiet of evening, and from the back room she could hear the soft, regular sound of Samuel sleeping, and Birdie Barrett, who had been careful and practical and entirely alone for 5 years, and who had not once looked at herself, and considered what she needed rather than what Samuel needed, felt something break open in her chest in the best possible way. "Marshall McCrae," she said. "Birdie Barrett," he said, "you are the most straightforward person I have ever met." "I have found that to be the most efficient approach," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in that particular way it had, and she felt warmth move all the way through her. "He does need a father," she said. Her voice was steady even if her heart was not, and she started again. "I have been alone for a very long time, not unhappily. I want you to understand that. I built something here that I am proud of." "I know," he said. "That is part of why I am standing here." "But," she said, and the word was a mirror of his own, "there is something to be said for not being alone." She looked at him. "And I think you know that I am not only talking about Samuel either." The smile that came to his face then was not the careful, contained thing she usually saw from him. It was unguarded and full, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger and more open, and she thought, with a sudden clarity, that she wanted to see that smile for the rest of her life. He did not kiss her that evening, because Samuel was in the next room and because Marshall McCrae was the kind of man who did things in the right order and with the right weight. But he took her hand across the counter, both his hands around her one hand, and held it for a long moment. And when he left, she stood at the window again with her palm against the glass, and this time she was smiling. The autumn came in properly, with its sharp mornings and golden afternoons, and the particular smell of the Texas grasslands in the fall that was something between grass and dust and cold sky. The nature of Marshall's visits to the shop changed, acquiring a warmth and directness that was still not declared in any formal sense, but that everyone in Caldwell Creek's small observant community registered and commented upon with varying degrees of subtlety, ranging from Lucinda Harlan's barely concealed satisfaction to old Tom Duffy's knowing smile every time Marshall came in for supplies and asked whether Miss Barrett had been by recently. He took her to supper at the hotel dining room on a Friday in October, and it was the most nervous she had been since she could remember, which struck her as both absurd and entirely appropriate, because she was 30 years old and she had buried her parents and her sister, and raised a child alone, and mended her own roof, and there was absolutely no reason for the presence of one particular man across a dinner table to make her palms damp, and yet there it was. He was nervous, too. She could see it in the way he set his fork down with more care than the fork required, and the knowledge that he was nervous made her feel something tender and warm for him that loosened her own nerves considerably. They talked all the way through dinner, and then sat over their coffee until the dining room was empty except for them, and the bored young man who worked the tables and who was too polite to ask them to leave. They talked about the things that were beginning to be between them, with a directness that was a little frightening and very honest. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the first months with Samuel when she had been so exhausted and so raw with grief that she had sometimes sat on the kitchen floor at 3 in the morning and been unable to remember how she had managed to exist before, and about how she had decided at some point that existing before had perhaps been the lesser version of a life that she did not yet recognize as lesser, until she had the greater version to compare it to. He told her about his years of traveling, which had not been unhappy but had had a quality of displacement that he had grown tired of, a sense of always being adjacent to other people's lives rather than inside his own. He said it carefully, choosing the words with precision, and she heard the loneliness in it without the self-pity, which was the same combination she had been carrying in herself for years. "I would like to court you properly," he said, when the candle on the table had burned down to a stub. "If that is acceptable to you." "That is acceptable to me," she said. Walking home that night through the cold October air, with her hand through the crook of his arm because the boardwalk had icy patches and it was practical to hold on, she thought about the word properly and found that she liked the sound of it very much. Not just the being courted but the properly, the care of it. The way it communicated that what was between them deserved the full weight of real intention. Samuel, when told the following morning that Mr. McCrae would be calling on them with a regularity and a purpose that was more than friendly, processed this information with the profound seriousness of a 5-year-old who understands that something important is happening and is determining what he thinks about it. He sat on the kitchen stool and looked at Birdie for a long time. "Does that mean he will be here more?" he finally asked. "Yes," Birdie said. Samuel nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "I have a lot more to learn about roping." Birdie laughed, really laughed, the full unguarded kind, and pulled him in off his stool and hugged him until he squirmed. And he was laughing too, and the kitchen was warm with it. The courtship that followed was one of the better things that happened in Birdie Barrett's life, which was saying something given how many good things had already happened. Marshall was attentive and considered and completely without affectation, a man who brought her wildflowers from the prairie because he thought she would like them rather than because he had been told it was the thing to do, and who listened when she talked about her work with the kind of genuine interest that told her he found the making of things compelling in itself. He had a dry wit that surfaced without warning, a quiet comment in the middle of an ordinary conversation that would catch her entirely off guard and make her laugh in the sudden delighted way that is the best kind of laugh. He was also quietly and consistently wonderful with Samuel, and Birdie watched this with a love that was vast and a little overwhelming. He did not try to be Samuel's father by announcement or declaration. He simply behaved with the patient and attentive consistency of a person who considered Samuel important, who showed up, who remembered what the boy had been learning and asked about it the next time, who took seriously the small accounts of 5-year-old adventure and concern that Samuel brought to him with the same full attention he gave to everything else. One evening in November, Birdie came out of the shop to find Marshall and Samuel sitting on the front steps in the cold, Marshall with his long legs stretched out, and Samuel pressed against his side for warmth. And Marshall was reading to him from the almanac, which was the only thing he apparently had in his coat pocket, but he was reading it with such elaboration and invention, turning the crop yield statistics into a story about competing farmers who had a disagreement about corn, that Samuel was entirely enthralled. Birdie stood in the doorway and watched them and felt something settle in her so completely and so finally that she understood there was nothing left to be uncertain about. She had a conversation with herself that night, alone after Samuel was in bed, with the lamp turned low and the winter wind pushing at the windows. She thought about Clara, as she sometimes did in important moments, not with pain anymore but with something closer to conversation, as though Clara were somewhere in the room and they were talking it through the way they used to. She thought about what Clara would say about Marshall McCrae, and she was certain she knew the answer, because Clara had been the sister who laughed easily and believed in things and would have looked at Marshall McCrae with his honest eyes and his patient hands and his ease with Samuel and would have said, quite simply, yes, that one. Obviously. In December, 3 days before Christmas, Marshall McCrae came to the shop at closing time and stood in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands, which was different from putting his hat on the counter. The hat in the hands was something else, something that made her heart quicken, and he said he had a question to ask her and he hoped she would not think it was too soon. "Ask me," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to marry you, and I want Samuel to have my name if that is what you both want, and I want to live here in Caldwell Creek and help you build whatever you are building and be present for it." He paused. "I know you have been alone for a long time and that you are not a person who needs rescuing. I'm not trying to rescue anything. I'm trying to join something that I think is very good and that I would like to be part of for the rest of my life." The lamp threw its warm light. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season were falling over Caldwell Creek, drifting past the window in the soft, indifferent way of snow that does not know it is beautiful. "Yes," she said. "Marshall, yes." He crossed the room and took her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, a proper first kiss, unhurried and entirely present, and she put her hands up against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms and thought, with a clarity that was almost funny in its simplicity, "There it is." They told Samuel at breakfast on Christmas morning, after the small gifts had been opened, which that year included a length of actual rope for Samuel with a card that said from Marshall, with a knot diagram drawn on the back in Marshall's careful hand. Samuel looked at the two of them across the table with an expression that was trying to be very adult and measured, but was in fact transparent with joy. "So you will live here?" he asked Marshall, with the directness of someone who needed the practical shape of things established before he could fully commit to his feelings about them. "If your Aunt Birdie will have me," Marshall said. Samuel looked at Birdie. "You should definitely have him," he said, with tremendous certainty. "He knows an enormous amount of things." Birdie laughed again, that full, unguarded laugh, and reached across the table and squeezed Samuel's hand. And Samuel looked at Marshall and extended his other hand very formally, and Marshall shook it with complete seriousness, and Samuel nodded as though contracts had been completed and the matter was satisfactorily settled. The wedding was in February of 1884, on a cold, clear Saturday when the sky was the particular blue that only exists in winter, hard and bright and immense above the flat land. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony in the white-painted church with its needed repainting, and Birdie wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool she had made herself the previous autumn in a moment of what she had told herself was practical preparation, and what she now acknowledged had been hopeful preparation. And she carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers, because there were no fresh ones in February, but she had kept these from the summer and pressed them in a book, and they still had their color. Marshall stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that fit him properly and a hat that he held until the ceremony began, and then handed to the man standing beside him, who was James Harlan, pressed into service as a witness. He watched Birdie walk toward him down the short aisle, and the expression on his face was one that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, a look of such unguarded and complete feeling that she felt it land in her chest like a held breath finally released. Samuel sat in the front pew with Lucinda Harlan's hand on one shoulder and an expression of tremendous concentration, as though by the force of his attention he could ensure that the ceremony went correctly. When Reverend Calloway reached the part where Marshall said "I do," Samuel mouthed the words along with him, and Birdie saw it from the corner of her eye and felt tears come to her eyes that she had been entirely unprepared for. And she blinked them back and smiled at Marshall, and he smiled back at her and said the words clearly and without hesitation. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the hotel, and Lucinda Harlan had organized a cake which was a minor miracle given the season. An old Duffy from the general store came by with a bottle of something that he said was from back east, and that proved to be a very fine whiskey. And several of the town women who had been customers at the millinery for years came to offer their congratulations with the warm sincerity of a community that had watched something good happen and was glad to have been present for it. Marshall stood beside Birdie through all of it with his hand at the small of her back, not possessively, but with the easy certainty of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. And she leaned into that certainty the way she had not let herself lean into anything for 5 years. And it felt, she decided, exactly like coming home after a journey that had been longer than expected but that had ended, finally, in the right place. The spring of 1884 was a good one in the Texas Panhandle, warm and green, with enough rain to fill the creek and bring the grass up bright. Marshall had left the Harlan Ranch and was working a stretch of land just east of their property, helping manage a modest cattle operation for an older rancher named Beaumont, who wanted a reliable man he could trust while his own health was uncertain. The work meant he was home every night, and Birdie had not been fully prepared for how different the house would feel with a man in it, not smaller or more crowded, but fuller, as though the rooms had been waiting without her knowing it for the sound of boots on the board floor and a second voice at the table. Samuel adapted to the change with the remarkable ease of a child who had decided something was good and was therefore prepared to embrace all of its particulars. He followed Marshall around the property on weekend mornings with a focused assistance that Marshall accepted with complete seriousness, handing him tools when asked and holding things steady and asking questions with a persistence that would have tired a lesser person, but that Marshall appeared to find genuinely interesting. He had the deep patience of a man who liked the essential nature of things, and explaining to Samuel how a hinge worked or why a fence post needed to be set at a particular depth, seemed to engage something real in him rather than requiring any effort. One April evening, Birdie was sitting on the porch in the last light, working on a hat commission, when Samuel came and sat beside her on the step. He was quiet for a moment in the thoughtful way he had sometimes, the way that meant he was working something out. "Aunt Birdie," he said. "Yes. Can I call him Pa?" She set her work down in her lap and looked at Samuel, who was looking back at her with an expression of enormous 6-year-old gravity, and she felt the full weight of the moment, every year of the 5 years before it. Every morning she had gotten him up, and every night she had read to him, and every time she had told him about Clara so that he would know where he came from. And now this small and massive question asked on a spring porch in the last light. "Let's ask him," she said. She called for Marshall, and he came out from the small barn where he had been doing something with the fence posts, still rolling his sleeves back down, and Samuel looked up at him with the same grave, intentional expression, and asked the question directly, the way Marshall himself talked, and something happened in Marshall McCrae's face that Birdie had never seen before, something that moved through him visibly, a full and unguarded emotion that he did not try to contain or compose. And he came and crouched down in front of Samuel so they were on the same level and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "There is nothing in the world I would like more," he said. Samuel nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has completed an important negotiation successfully. Then he threw his arms around Marshall's neck with the sudden wholehearted impulsiveness of a child, and Marshall's arms came around him and held him, and Birdie put her hand over her mouth and watched, and felt the tears come that she did not try to stop this time. Marshall looked at her over Samuel's shoulder, and his eyes were not dry either, and he held out one hand toward her, and she took the 2 steps off the porch and took his hand, and the 3 of them were together in the spring evening in the yard of the house she had built and was still building, and it was so good, so fundamentally and completely good, that she stood in it without thinking anything for a moment, just feeling it. The summer of 1884 settled over Caldwell Creek with its usual heat, but the heat that year felt different to Birdie, lighter somehow, as though the warmth in her life had changed the quality of the warmth outside it. The millinery shop continued to do well, and she took on a girl named Opal, 16 and quick with her hands, to help with the increasing workload as the town grew. Marshall's work with Beaumont's cattle was reliable and honest, and they talked in the evenings about the future with the ease of people who are not afraid of it, about whether they might eventually take on their own piece of land, about what that might look like, about Samuel's education and the new schoolteacher who had arrived from Illinois and who was, by Samuel's account, very strict about letters but very interesting about history. In September, Birdie discovered she was expecting. She told Marshall on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the window open and the September air coming through, and she watched his face go through surprise and then something that was not quite joy but was bigger than joy, something that took up all the available space in his expression. "Are you?" he said, and then could not continue, which was remarkable for a man who always found the right word. "Yes," she said. He got up from his chair and came around the table and pulled her up and held her with a fierceness that said more than the words he was apparently temporarily unable to produce, and she held him back and laughed into his shoulder. Samuel, when told, looked at the 2 of them and then looked at Birdie's stomach with the expression of a child processing a complicated piece of information. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Birdie said. Samuel considered this. "I would like a brother," he said carefully, "but I will accept a sister." "That is very gracious of you," Marshall said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it had. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and long, but the house was warm, and Birdie sewed small things in the evenings, and Marshall finished building a proper 2nd bedroom that had been on their list of things to do and had now become urgent. And Samuel helped by handing him things and asking questions, and sometimes holding the lamp steady when the light was needed somewhere specific. The town of Caldwell Creek hummed with its usual winter business, and the railroad talk had solidified into actual construction crews in the distance, and Duffy at the general store said the line would reach them by 1886, and that the town would be different after that, bigger and more connected to the wider world. Birdie thought about the wider world sometimes. She thought about the injustices that the wider world contained, the things she saw in miniature even in a small town. She thought about the Comanche families who had been pushed from this land in the years before she arrived, whose presence was now mainly archaeological, a history that the land carried in its bones, even when the people who lived on it preferred not to think about it. She thought about the black cowboy who worked for Harlan and who was unquestionably one of the best riders on the ranch, and who was paid less than the white hands and given the worst quarters, something she had mentioned to Lucinda once, and which Lucinda had received with the slight discomfort of a woman who understood the injustice, but did not know how to change it within the structure of her life. Birdie could not change these things, not in any grand sense, but she kept her shop open to everyone and her prices the same for everyone, and she taught Samuel to see people plainly and judge them by the content of what they did, which was the only piece of the wider world she had direct authority over. She talked to Marshall about these things and found him in full agreement with a directness that did not require him to be convinced, simply a man who looked at the world and saw it honestly, which she had understood from the beginning was one of his fundamental qualities. On the 17th of April, 1885, in the early morning when the light was coming up pale and cold over the flat Texas sky, their son was born. The labor was attended by the town doctor and by Lucinda Harlan, who had arrived the evening before and remained with a calm authority that Birdie was deeply grateful for. Marshall stayed as close as he was permitted and was present when it was over, and when the doctor placed the baby in his arms, Marshall McCrae, who was a steady and composed man in almost all circumstances, stood in the center of the room and looked down at his son with an expression that was so open and so full that Birdie, exhausted and triumphant in the bed, felt a love for him that was vast and bottomless and entirely sure of itself. They named him James, after James Harlan, who had stood as witness at their wedding, and who received this honor with a gruff and visibly moved pleasure. Samuel met his cousin James, as he was now to be understood, on the morning following the birth, and regarded the baby with the fascinated skepticism of a child encountering something that looks less impressive than described. "He is very small," Samuel said. "You were very small once," Marshall told him. Samuel received this information with visible doubt. "I don't think so," he said. "I have evidence," Birdie said from the bed. "I kept your first shirt. You fit in my hand." Samuel looked at baby James again with a new and more respectful consideration. "All right," he said. "I suppose he'll grow." "He will," Marshall assured him. "And when he does, you'll have someone to teach." Samuel looked up at Marshall with an expression that was computing this, and then a slow smile spread across his face, the generous, uncomplicated Clara smile that Birdie loved so much. "I know how to rope," Samuel said. "You do," Marshall said. "I can teach him roping." "You can." "That is a reasonable plan," Samuel said, with great satisfaction, and went to find his own breakfast. And Marshall sat on the edge of the bed with baby James in his arms and Birdie's hand in his, and the morning light came through the window and fell across all three of them. And then Samuel came back with bread and honey, because he had decided his aunt needed it, and because he was a boy of action when the situation called for it. The spring moved into summer, and James grew with the aggressive velocity of healthy babies, filling out his small clothes almost as fast as Birdie could sew them. Samuel proved to be a conscientious and self-appointed guardian, deeply invested in the baby's development and extremely vocal about anyone or anything. He considered a potential threat to James's well-being, including a stray dog who had wandered too close to the porch, and who Samuel had herded away with the authority of someone who considered this his professional responsibility. Marshall watched Samuel with James and felt a fullness in himself that he recognized as something he had not had before. A sense of stakes in the world that were deep and real and his. Not simply the rootless competence of a man who could do his work wherever the work happened to be, but the grounded and particular love of a man who had something to protect and something to build and people to build it with. He thought sometimes about the years before Caldwell Creek, the long moving years, not with regret but with a kind of gratitude for their ending. He had been a man without a fixed point, skilled and capable and more or less content, but without the anchor of a place or a person. And then the road had brought him to a dusty main street in the Texas Panhandle on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. And there had been a woman on the boardwalk with a broom and dark hair and eyes that were already looking at the world with the clear and steady regard of someone who did not need to be impressed but could be interested. And the road had simply, quietly, ended. The summer of 1885 was marked by a drought that came in July and stayed, the land going brown and the creek dropping low, and the ranchers' faces tightening with the particular anxiety of people whose livelihood is written in the weather. The Beaumont operation required extra management during this period, long days in the heat moving cattle to better grazing and managing water, and Marshall came home in the evenings worn down but not dispirited, because he had the thing that the drought could not touch, and he walked through the door, and Samuel said Pa and baby James recognized his voice and kicked his legs. And Birdie looked at him from across the room with that particular steadiness in her eyes that now had a warmth in it that she no longer tried to moderate, and all the weight of the day reorganized itself around the right kind of tiredness. The drought broke in September with 3 days of rain that the whole town received with the fervent gratitude of people who have been reminded of their dependence on something larger than themselves. The creek ran full, and the grass came back pale and tentative, and the ranchers let out their held breath, and the town breathed easier, and Caldwell Creek held its annual autumn social at which the Harlan Ranch provided fiddle players, and the hotel provided a room, and everyone danced until the candles burned down. Birdie danced with Marshall for the first time at that social, and she was a good dancer, something she had almost forgotten about herself in the years of being too busy to dance. And Marshall was better than she had expected, not formally trained but naturally rhythmic, moving with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything. And they danced in the warm, crowded room with Samuel asleep against Lucinda's shoulder in the corner and James sleeping in the basket Mrs. Duffy had offered to watch. And it was such an uncomplicated and complete happiness that Birdie felt it almost as something physical, a warmth in the center of her chest that radiated outward. The railroad arrived in Caldwell Creek in the spring of 1886, as Duffy had predicted, and the town changed as he had also predicted, more people coming through, a few staying, the hotel expanding a room, a second general store opening with competition that made Duffy sharpen his prices and improve his stock, which was ultimately good for everyone. The millinery shop found new customers among the women coming in from other settlements, and Birdie expanded the shop's scope a little, taking on fancier orders for women who had the means to want them, while keeping the basic and honest service that had always been her foundation. Samuel started in the second reading group at school, which was an advancement the teacher, Miss Hartwell from Illinois, communicated with the same directness she apparently brought to everything, sending a note home that said Samuel Barrett is a quick and attentive student with a particular gift for narrative comprehension, which Marshall read and then looked at Birdie and said, "That is absolutely your influence." "He gets the narrative comprehension from Clara," Birdie said. "Clara could read anything and tell you back the whole of it." Marshall received this with a nod that acknowledged Clara's place in the room they always lived in together, the room that included the people they had lost and loved and carried forward. He had come to understand the full shape of Birdie's love for her sister, the way that love was woven into her love for Samuel, and through that into everything else, and he had made it his habit to keep Clara present, to say her name, to tell Samuel things about her that Birdie had told him, so that the boy grew up knowing his mother as a real and particular person. On a morning in November of 1886, when James was 18 months old and determinedly trying to walk, and falling with the cheerful persistence of a person who has not yet learned to be discouraged by failure, Birdie was standing at the window of the shop watching the street when she felt a familiar sensation, and understood with the particular internal clarity that a woman who has been through it once has access to that she was expecting again. She told Marshall that evening, after Samuel was in bed and James was sleeping his heavy baby sleep in the second bedroom, in the kitchen with the lamp on the table between them, and Marshall's face did the same thing it had done the first time, that full, unguarded movement of emotion, and he reached across the table and took her hand and said, simply, "Good. Good," she agreed. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you," he searched for the word, "glad?" She looked at him, at the honest planes of his face in the lamplight, at the eyes that saw her clearly and steadily, and without any of the additions or subtractions that other people's perceptions sometimes required, and she felt the truth of her life so completely and precisely that it was almost too much to contain. "I am glad every day," she said. "I want you to know that. Not every day is easy, but every day I am glad." He was quiet for a moment with his hand around hers. Then he said, "So am I." In the spring of 1887, they had a daughter. She came on a May morning when the prairie was doing its best impression of a place that was not trying to kill you, the grass green and the sky wide and pale blue and the wind mild for once, almost gentle. She was born with a considerable amount of dark hair and an immediate and confident voice, and Samuel, when introduced to her, looked at her with a considered and measuring expression and then said, "She has a lot to say already," which was both accurate and prophetic. They named her Clara because there had never been any question about what her name would be, and when Marshall wrote it in the family Bible, Birdie sat beside him and put her hand on his arm and felt the name settle into the room and into the future, and it was good. It was entirely good, and she said very quietly, "Thank you for understanding that." He looked at her. "She was your sister," he said. "She is Samuel's mother. She belongs in this family." Birdie pressed her lips together and nodded, and did not try to speak, because there were no words that were large enough for what she was feeling, only the hand on his arm and the lamplight and the baby in the basket, and the wide quiet of the Texas night outside the window. Samuel took his role as the eldest with the seriousness of a boy who had been looking for exactly this kind of responsibility. He was 7 now, old enough to be genuinely useful, and he appointed himself baby Clara's primary explainer, the person whose job it was to acquaint her with the world she had arrived in. He told her about the horses and the prairie and the school and the rope and Duchess, who had been Marshall's horse for years now, and who Samuel considered a personal friend. He told her about their grandmother in the family Bible and about their mother Clara, whose name she now carried, in the same way that Birdie had always told him, with love and directness and no softening. James, at 18 months, was mostly interested in the baby as a curiosity that had appeared in the house, and was unclear on whether to approve or reserve judgment. He approached the basket with caution, and then discovered that the baby would grab his finger if he offered it, and from that moment he was a committed elder brother, very invested in baby Clara's finger-grabbing development. Marshall watched his children and felt the ground beneath him as solid and real as anything he had ever known, the particular solidity of a life that has found its shape. He was not a sentimental man by nature, or rather he was a man whose sentiment ran deep, but expressed itself in action rather than speech, in the consistency of his presence, in the way he showed up every day without exception, in the fence he mended before being asked, and the wood he split before it was needed, and the way he watched Samuel rope a fence post on a Saturday afternoon with the same full attention he had given the first demonstration 5 years ago in a dusty livery paddock. The same genuine interest, the same real pride. On a September evening in 1887, with baby Clara 4 months old and sleeping in her basket and James toddling around the kitchen, with the focused determination of a child who has recently mastered walking and is conducting a thorough inspection of everything he can reach, and Samuel doing his letters at the table with a concentration that was entirely his great aunt Birdie's influence and his mother Clara's gift. Marshall sat on the porch in the cooling evening air and looked out at the flat land going gold in the last light, and felt a completeness that was not complacency, not the complacency of a man who has stopped wanting things, but the rare and genuine satisfaction of a man who has exactly what he wants and knows it. Birdie came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee, and they sat together in the evening quiet the way they had developed the habit of doing, this specific porch and this specific time of day, the day settling around them, the house full of their children and warm with it. "I have been thinking," Marshall said. "You do that a great deal," she said. "I have been thinking about Beaumont's land," he said. "He told me yesterday that he is looking to sell. His health is not improving and his family want him east with them." He paused. "It is a good piece of land, Birdie, good water, fair grazing. We could run a proper operation on it." She looked at him. "We," she said. "We," he confirmed with absolute certainty. She thought about this, about what it would mean, about the money and the risk and the work, and looked out at the September land and the September sky and felt the scope of the life in front of them, the years of it, the building of it. "Tell me about the water," she said. He talked, and she listened, and they planned together in the way they did everything together, thoroughly and practically, and with a shared vision of what they were building that had never needed to be stated explicitly because it was simply present between them, the way a river is present in a landscape, a fundamental thing that the landscape is organized around. In the spring of 1888, Marshall McCrae purchased Beaumont's land and cattle with money saved from 5 years of ranch work, and the proceeds of a modest property in Missouri that had finally sold after years of waiting, and Birdie invested what the millinery shop had put aside in 5 years of careful management, and together they had enough to begin. The operation was small at first, as honest operations tend to be, built on competence and hard work rather than borrowed ambition, and Marshall managed it with the same unhurried effectiveness he brought to everything, while Birdie kept the shop and the family and the accounts with the neat precision that had always been her nature. Samuel, 9 years old now and deeply invested in the cattle operation as a matter of personal identity, spent every free hour that was not school learning everything Marshall would teach him, which was considerable, and took to the work with the same appetite and attention his father brought to it. James, at 3, insisted on boots, real cowboy boots, which Marshall found him and which James wore everywhere including to bed on 2 separate occasions, until Birdie established a clear policy about boots and sleeping. Baby Clara grew into a small person of tremendous opinion and considerable charm, combining her mother's steadiness with some quality that was entirely her own, a bright particular certainty about the world and her place in it that made everyone who spent time with her feel that things were going to work out correctly. The years moved forward as years do, not in the slow, contemplative fashion of a life being observed, but in the fast and full way of a life being lived, full of seasons and work and small crises and large joys, the ordinary weave of a family's time. The cattle operation grew steadily, not dramatically, but honestly the way Marshall had always said he wanted to build it. The millinery shop became an institution in Caldwell Creek, a place that the town knew and trusted and sent its daughters to learn from as well as its wives and mothers to buy from. Samuel, at 12, wrote as well as most men and better than most, and had the rope work he had been promised as something he could be excellent at with attention and effort, and was excellent at with the particular satisfaction of someone who has earned a skill by the exact means they were told it required. He talked about his mother with the easy comfort of a child who has always known her as a real presence in his family's history rather than an absence, and when strangers asked, he said his mother was Clara Barrett, who had been wonderful, and his pa had married his Aunt Birdie, who was also wonderful, and he had a brother named James and a sister named Clara, and they lived on a ranch east of Caldwell Creek. He said all of this with the simple and complete contentment of someone who knows precisely who they are and where they come from, and finds it more than sufficient. Birdie turned 35 in the autumn of 1889 and felt no particular anxiety about the number, because she was living inside a life that was bigger than any number she had attached to herself. The ranch was doing well, and the shop was doing well, and her children were healthy and growing, and Marshall McCrae was still, and always the man she had understood him to be from the beginning, steady and honest and present, aging as all of them were aging but wearing it well, the weathered quality of his face simply more itself now, the dark eyes still with that quality of seeing what was in front of him and actually registering it. They celebrated her birthday at the ranch with a supper that Marshall had organized with what he called logistical efficiency, and what the children called a surprise, and which involved Lucinda Harlan and her husband and the Duffy family, and the new schoolteacher who had become a friend and old Reverend Calloway, who was still officiating events in Caldwell Creek, and who ate an extraordinary amount of cake without apparent self-consciousness. Samuel made a speech in the manner of someone who has been practicing it, earnest and precise, and James fell asleep under the table, and little Clara sat beside Birdie and held her hand through the whole supper with the quiet, devoted solemnity of a 4-year-old, who was not entirely sure what a birthday was but was committed to participating correctly. After the guests had gone, Marshall and Birdie sat on the porch of the ranch house, which was a proper porch now, not the small stoop the original house had had, and the night was clear and vast with the particular sky of the Texas Panhandle in October, stars so thick and close that the sky seemed to be doing something deliberate with them. "You are very quiet," Marshall said. "I am thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the stars and thought about the woman who had stood at a graveside in 1878 with a baby wrapped in a flannel blanket and a hollowed-out grief, and a complete absence of any clear idea about the future. She thought about the 2 rooms she had added to a 1-room house, and the hat shop in the front room, and Jeremiah Foss and his hammer, and the 5 years of mornings and nights with Samuel. She thought about an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and a bay horse, and a dusty brown hat and eyes that caught the light across a main street, and a conversation over coffee in a storm-dark kitchen. She thought about Samuel on his stool asking if he could call him Pa. She thought about James in his boots and Clara holding her hand through the birthday supper. About all of it, she said. How it went. Marshall was quiet beside her. He understood, she knew, the full scope of what she meant because he had been in most of it and she had told him the rest. "How does it seem to you?" he asked. She turned to look at him, at the face she knew as well as she knew her own hands, at the honest eyes in the starlight, at the man who had ridden into a dusty street on an ordinary Tuesday and said, quite simply, "He needs a father too," meaning he, meaning all of them, meaning himself. "Like more than I had any right to expect," she said, "and exactly what I needed." He reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the stars were enormous over the flat Texas land. And inside the ranch house, their 3 children were sleeping. Samuel in the big room with his rope coiled on the peg by the door, and his boots placed carefully beside the bed the way Marshall had taught him. James in his small bed with 1 boot on because he had fallen asleep before the policy could be properly enforced. And little Clara in her room with her hands folded under her cheek the way she always slept, already the image of the grandmother she would never meet and the great-grandmother she had never known, dark-haired and certain, and entirely her own person. The night was quiet around them except for the wind, which was always there on the Texas plain, and which Birdie had long ago stopped hearing as a grievance, and had come to hear instead as simply the sound of the country they lived in, the deep specific music of the place that had turned out, against all the odds and expectations of a difficult world, to be exactly home. Marshall pressed his lips to the top of her head and held her hand and said nothing, because he was a man who understood that some things were complete and needed no addition. And this was one of them. This porch and this night and this woman and all the living that had brought them here and all the living that still remained ahead. And the stars came down over Caldwell Creek and the ranch east of it, and the small house that had become a life, and everything that needed to be was settled, and everything that needed to be closed was closed, and everything that had been lost had been carried forward and honored in the names of the living. And the land held them all without judgment in the way that land does, permanent and patient, and as close as this hard, beautiful country ever got to gentle. The morning would come again, as it always did, with the sound of boots on the board floor and small voices, and the smell of coffee, and the long flat horizon going gold with the first light. And Marshall McCrae would come in from checking on the horses, and Birdie Barrett McCrae would be at the stove with her hair still loose from sleep, and Samuel would be up already, and James would be demanding his boots, and little Clara would be explaining something important to the cat that had adopted them the previous spring. And it would be an ordinary morning, fully and completely ordinary, and it would be everything